Hey, welcome to this tutorial on completing assignment 8 in your amphibian monitoring classroom. This assignment is going to teach you how to analyze the data that you've collected and your classmates have collected about amphibians, about frog calls this year and last year. You'll notice that there are two attachments for this assignment. The first one is a document which is what you'll actually turn in here, and it'll walk you through how to analyze the data. One of the first things to do is to come up with a question that you're interested in answering. You get to choose your question here, and so you can read over some of the samples, and maybe one of those questions jumps out as you as being kind of an interesting question. Or maybe it reminds you of something else that you might try to answer. Or maybe your experience out in the field when you were actually listening to frog calls made you notice something or think about something, a question that you think you could use the data to answer. I'm going to work based on the experience that I had out in the field, and one thing I noticed or I thought about when I was out there is that what about the weather conditions? I went out on one day that was really clear and another day that was cloudy and slightly drizzly, and I had a different experience with the frogs that I heard. So I came up with the question, how do weather conditions affect tree frog calls? I decided to focus in on tree frogs in particular because those are the frogs that I heard. And so I'm just going to focus on those. Your question might be about all frogs. It might be about one species in particular. The other attachment that you'll notice is the spreadsheet with all the data that students have collected. This is a copy that's made specifically for you, and so you don't have to worry about messing up the data in here. I mean, you want to make sure you don't mess up the data for your own analysis, but you can make changes when you need to and not worry that you're messing up the spreadsheet for other people. This is your copy. One thing you might notice right away when looking at the spreadsheet is there's a lot more information here than you might need to answer your specific question. For instance, I'm looking at weather conditions and tree frog calls, so I need this information in this column about weather conditions. I also need the information about tree frogs. There's a lot here that I don't actually need. I don't need the GPS coordinates or the site characteristics, not to answer my specific question at least. You'll also notice that there are a lot of rows here. There's a lot of data that's been collected this year and last year. We need to do something to simplify things for us. And I'm going to suggest you actually make a table by hand to help kind of organize and collect the specific data you need to answer your specific question. So I'll begin to pull together a data table myself based on the spreadsheet. I put my question up top to help remind me what I'm doing. And then I'm going to go ahead and create some different weather categories. So I noticed categories like clear. And people reported. They also reported that they did their surveys in light rain. Some people said drizzle. I'm going to include light rain and drizzle together. I also saw rain. Some people said things like medium rain. Fog and mist, I'll put those together, and storm. These are different categories I saw on the spreadsheet. And for each of these categories, I'm going to tally up how many tree frogs were heard. And so my first column is going to be surveys with tree frogs. Okay, I also need to know when someone went out and saw the weather that was clear, but they didn't see any tree frogs. So without tree frogs. And then later I'm going to have a total column. So I can actually calculate a percentage of times that it was clear and people heard tree frogs. Percentage of times it was light rain and people heard tree frogs. I'm back to my spreadsheet and I'm looking at the row. This person did a survey and the weather conditions were clear and they did hear a tree frog. It's checked for tree frog. So that's one for clear with the tree frog. Here's another survey, clear with the tree frog. I'll add another tally mark. The next one's light rain with a tree frog. I'll add a tally mark. Okay, I'm actually noticing that it's getting kind of hard to go from a weather condition over here to tree frogs. So let me show you something you can do. We don't need any of this information about precipitation in the past 48 hours or temperature. We can actually delete these columns. There's a drop down at each column, and I can delete them. I'm not going to need them. This is my spreadsheet. I'm going to get rid of them here. Okay, much better. Now I have the weather conditions right next to whether tree frogs were seen or not. That's going to be a lot nicer as I continue going through my checklist. Okay, I've tallied these all up now. I had to make some pretty small tally marks. After I tallied them up, I totaled them within the box, and then I put a total of the number of times that clear was observed, whether it was with tree frogs or without tree frogs, and that was 71. As you can see, it's important to kind of do this because there were a lot more times that it was like that people went out and did their observations on a clear day than they did when there was light rain. I've calculated some percentages here now, and you can see some interesting patterns emerging. When it's clear out, when people did observations on frogs when it was clear, 78.9% of the time they actually heard tree frogs. And that's the highest percentage. Cloudy was the next high, 71% of the time when it was cloudy, tree frogs were heard. Tree frogs were never heard when it was stormy or foggy or misty. Although this is interesting, there weren't very many observations when it was stormy or foggy or misty. So this might not be very representative, right? There was only one time that someone did an observation in a storm. So maybe tree frogs are common in storms. We just don't know. We didn't go out enough times. You need to create a new graph in order to display the data. And you can do that on a new tab or a new sheet. You can click this plus button to add a sheet, and it adds a tab down here. In this case, it's called Sheet 7, although I could rename it. I'll rename it something like Weather Conditions. Now, I want to create a graph that displays the percentages that I just calculated so that I have a nice visual representation of data that could answer the question about how weather conditions affect tree frog calls. Okay, here's the data table that I created. It's pretty simple. It doesn't have to be pretty. I'm going to go ahead and create a graph now. I'm going to select all the data that I want to graph here and insert a chart. Google's done a pretty good job creating a sort of graph that I'd like to use. This bar chart will work nicely, so I'm going to go with it. One thing is that this title is not very descriptive. And so I'm going to title it with the question that I'm asking. And so it looks like we got an answer to the question. It looks like the data are showing that clear conditions are the best for frog calls. When people went out for surveys in clear conditions, 78.9% of the time, almost 80% of the time, they heard frog calls. A little less frequently when it was cloudy or when there was rain. You're going to be asked to insert an image of your chart into the Google document for data analysis. And you can do that by clicking the drop-down menu, by clicking these three little dots. You can copy the chart. And now that it's copied, you can paste it into your document. One of the things that you're going to be asked to do is think about and answer how well do your data, how well do they actually answer the question that you're investigating. You're going to be looking for sources of error. And you can certainly mention things like maybe students not being really careful listeners. But I also want you to think on a kind of broader scale of were the surveys that we did representative? In other words, we're looking for how weather conditions affect tree frog calls. Do we have a good picture of that? One thing that stands out to me right away is that students might be more likely to go for their tree frog calls on a clear day. They're less likely to go when it's foggy or misty or stormy. And so we only had a few observations for fog and mist, and we don't really know if it's actually true that tree frogs don't call in the fog or mist. And so we'd want to collect more data. Maybe students only went to ponds and they didn't go to creeks or rivers. And so maybe this actually tells us about the weather conditions that tree frogs call in at ponds specifically, and that we would find a different pattern if we had more representative data for all the different environments that tree frogs could be in. Okay, I hope that's helpful as you are trying to pick the question that you might answer. Make sure that you reach out for help sooner rather than later. The sooner you can have a clear idea of how you're going to answer this question, how you're going to build your own data table by hand, and what your graph is going to look like, the quicker that you'll be able to get to work. And so if you do have any questions, please reach out. Good luck.